This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 122 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. In this eye-opening episode, I sit down with Dr. Jordan Wright, a psychologist who brings both professional insight and lived experience to the conversation, having been diagnosed with ADHD in college. Together, we explore the often overlooked stories of kids who manage to compensate for ADHD symptoms well into adolescence or adulthood, only to receive a diagnosis later in life. We also dive into why early education settings are crucial for embedding executive functioning supports and how these skills can be proactively taught rather than reactively addressed. Our guest offers a compelling argument for why executive functioning should be considered the new social-emotional learning, essential, foundational, and deeply tied to lifelong success. We also spend a fair amount of time talking about best practices for executive functioning assessment in a way that is robust and sensitive to diverse learning needs, moving to a deeper understanding. Some topics we covered are being diagnosed with ADHD in college and why high-performing kids with ADHD are often missed, the case for embedding executive functioning support into early education as a universal design initiative, executive functioning as the new SEL, and what educators and other professionals working in education and healthcare need to know, and best practices for executive functioning assessment, including surveys, non-standardized methods, and optimal performance measures, among other ways to think about assessment. Dr. Jordan Wright is the Chief Clinical Officer at Parallel Learning and leading clinical psychologist who specializes in psychological assessment, including learning disabilities and ADHD. And he's on the faculty at New York University, where he leads the Clinical Counseling Psychology PhD program, training doctoral students in psychological assessment and counseling. And he founded and runs the Center for Counseling and Community Wellbeing, the low-fee community mental health training clinic at NYU. Dr. Jordan has authored multiple widely used books on psychological assessment, including Conducting Psychological Assessment, a guide for practitioners, Essentials for Psychological Telehealth Assessment with Susie Radford, Essentials of Psychological Assessment Supervision, and with Gary Groth Marnett, the 6th edition of the Handbook of Psychological Assessment, the most widely used text in graduate training on assessment. His most recent book is Essentials of Culture in Psychological Assessment, which focuses on areas of diversity, culture, privilege, and oppression, and how we evaluate and understand individuals. Whether you're a parent, educator, or clinician, this episode is a must listen. Before we get going, don't forget to check out the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course to help school leaders launch their executive functioning implementation plan. If you are on a school team and you're in a leadership position, or you aspire to be in a leadership position, and you'd like to take that first step in learning about executive functioning, learning about these critical skills that can support kids and how we can start thinking about frameworks that can help us implement them across a multidisciplinary team and potentially across a school or district, then I walk you through how to get started in the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support. You can learn more about this 7-day compression email course at drkarendudek-brannan.com /school leaders. Now, please enjoy this interview with Dr. Jordan. Today, I am joined by Dr. Jordan Wright from Parallel Learning and New York University. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I am really excited to talk with you today. I know that we've got a lot of topics we want to get into, but first, let's start off by having you share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I am a psychologist. So I'm a licensed psychologist in a bunch of different states. And I am on faculty. I'm a professor at New York University. I run our doctoral program in clinical and counseling psychology. I'm also the chief clinical officer at Parallel Learning. And how I came to this in general is I went all the way through school. I did very well in school, but I went all the way through school without reading a book.
Oh,
And
wow.
I got to college and it was much more reading intensive than I was used to and thought, oh, maybe I should go get evaluated for a learning disability because I have not read a book. I don't I just can't do it. There's something I
Uh-huh.
managed to get through, but there was something wrong and I got evaluated. And it turns out I don't have a learning disability. My reading is just fine. I have ADHD.
Okay.
That was identified way too late. It was identified when I was in college. And I think back to a different trajectory, a different way my life could have looked, how much easier my life could have been had it been identified much earlier and remediated or accommodated for, or maybe even medicated.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I did get prescribed Ritalin in college and tried it once or twice and did not like how it felt, and so
Mm-hmm.
decided to go a different route and just get some training and some skills and power through it. And decided that psychology was for me eventually and ended up getting my a master's in psychology and education and then a doctorate in clinical psychology from Columbia. Um, and fast forwarding after being licensed, practicing, being on faculty, um, decided that one of my biggest passions is about access, wanting more kids to have access to the assessment that I didn't get early enough. And was lucky enough to be approached by Diana Heldfund, who is the founder and CEO of Parallel Learning, who had a similar mission. She had a very different story. She was identified much earlier on and got everything she needed and became successful because of all the supports she got early on. But a very similar mission
Mm-hmm.
emerged from her story to make sure more kids have access. Their waiting lists are too long. Schools are out of compliance. There's just too much need out there for the number of school psychologists, SLPs, OTs, all the people we
Mm-hmm.
need contributing to these evaluations. So I started doing research on teleassessment, on what we could do remotely. I was being hired to drive to upstate New York. I live in the city. So I was
Okay.
driving 3.5 hours to do an evaluation of a kid and then driving 3.5 hours back and was thinking to myself, I could have evaluated 3 or 4 kids in that.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to know what would be valid, what would be ethical, what would be reliable in an assessment done remotely, and started doing that research in about 2015. And published on it, did some good research on it, and nobody cared until about 2020. Something happened. I
Oh,
can't remember
yeah. Something happened in 2020.
can't remember what it was, but something
Yeah.
happened and it became very, very sexy. And now
Yeah.
everybody wants to know about teleassessment. And I ended up they asked me to write a book about it, so I have authored the only book on the topic and authored a bunch of guidance to keep schools going, to keep kids didn't stop developing in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
They were still developing, they still had needs, so we couldn't just stop assessing and evaluating kids. So I was trying to help give the tools for our entire industry to keep meeting needs. And that's what we're doing at Parallel as well, is trying to partner with schools and school districts to increase capacity so that kids get seen, kids get the supports and the evaluations that they need.
Well, that's very timely because of so many things happening right now with public education and education as a whole. I would love to go back to what you said about how you got through without really having to read a book. And I can just think of, so many kids that where it's like they're going through elementary school, high school, and something's going on, but technically the grades look okay. And I just feel like it almost feels like you're in the eye of a hurricane where you're like, what's going to happen? Like when are things going to like come to a situation where we realize that, there's an issue here? Where's the breaking point? And I know that my husband had, I wouldn't say the same situation that you did, but he doesn't have an ADHD diagnosis, but got evaluated. And I think he was in fifth grade. And I think that if he would have gotten evaluated later on, he probably would have got diagnosed. And college was a very different story for him. We won't get into that. But yeah, like I think of so many people where it's just when does it get to the point? Sometimes it's in elementary school where you realize we have to do an evaluation, and some people are somehow able to power through. So, like, how did that look for you when you were going through high school?
Yeah, I'm a weird case because I actually thrived in elementary, middle, and high school. I was a really good test taker. I'm a good writer somehow without having read a book. I learned
Okay.
to write. I went to a really rigorous sort of private school that had a lot of, it didn't have sort of supports for me, but there was very small class sizes, and I
Yeah.
managed to listen enough to class discussions to be able to do well on the tests. I
Hmm.
found ways to go through. But your question is a good one because it's a developmental question,
Yeah.
right? So we have kids who can compensate until they can't. For
Yeah.
me, that point was college. I was compensating super well all until I had a class where it was like, you have to read everything Shakespeare ever wrote, and that is your semester. I was like, oh, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Um, but for many kids, they can compensate until third grade, right?
Hmm.
Till the like whenever that switch comes from learning to read to reading to learn,
Hmm.
right? And we know they're not amazing students, but maybe they're B students and passing. And
Hmm.
when schools are overburdened, when they're under-resourced, when they're underfunded, when they have too many kids, when they have the class sizes are too big, we have to go to the squeaky wheels, right? We have to go to the kids who are so obviously struggling
Yeah.
that all those kids who are muddling through and sort of passable are exactly like you said, they're in the eye of the storm. We
Yeah.
can't give them the attention that
Hmm.
we should be giving them. We can't give them the evaluations or the supports early on because they're scraping by. They're doing
Hmm.
okay. And there are many kids who just aren't. And we have to give them all of the attention and supports. So I worry about those kids. I worry
Yeah.
about the kids like me who look like they're doing just okay until that point comes when they actually aren't able to compensate anymore because the curriculum gets too complicated, complex, nuanced. It just gets harder.
Yeah. And I know, so the topic of accommodations is interesting because when I have had conversations with school teams, it's a lot of times we look at grades, which, and I'm not discounting the value of grades, but I think most of us would agree that they are one piece of information and they're not the whole person. They're not the only thing that gives us an accurate measure of how someone is doing. And when you think about the cost of compensation, or maybe the cost of compensation that isn't the best, like maybe optimal, I guess would be the way that I would word it is how do you to put accommodations in place that are useful, that are going to carry through to productive accommodations in adult life so that someone can truly understand, like, how am I going to take these supports that I'm getting in elementary school or high school and translate that to college or to when I have a job, so that we're not giving so much support that people are prompt dependent, that they can actually take these accommodations and put their own scaffolding in place on their own. And some of the accommodations, they almost seem a little cookie cutter, where it's like, oh, they have, he or she or they have ADHD, so let's give them a break card. Well, maybe depending on how you use that break, but if it's too superficial, then it doesn't really teach someone to understand what their needs are. So, like, what do you think would have been useful for you that you didn't have when you were younger, as far as accommodations or maybe services?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there are two. My mind is going two places. One is the cookie cutter recommendations,
Mm-hmm.
which drive me nuts because had I been diagnosed early with my ADHD, they might have given me the accommodation to like take tests in a room alone. And
Mm-hmm.
the way my brain works, I need stimulation. I need stuff going on around me in order to focus. So like when I'm writing, I write books, and when I'm writing, I have the TV on and music playing. It drives my family nuts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I need all of that. So being in a room alone would have been the absolute wrong accommodation for me.
Yeah.
Whereas other kids with ADHD, that's exactly what they need. So those cookie cutter recommendations, I think, have real shortfalls. But when it comes to actual accommodations or skills or remediation that I think we need to be implementing more of, things that would have helped me. I'm a big believer in two things. One is I'm a big believer in individualized learning. And I
Mm-hmm.
know that's sort of buzzwordy, and we
Yeah.
should be doing that with every kid, and teachers are amazing and are trying to do this, but I don't know that we are setting them up for success to actually do it well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if our current educational system, the way that it's built, the way that it's developed, the way that it's under-resourced, allows teachers to truly individualize education within the classroom. I think when that is done, we need fewer formal accommodations for any kid. I think
Yeah.
we're really paying attention to where and how this kid thrives. And we tailor our system to that. If we have a set of kids that are much more hands-on learners, and we give them a project to do and the rest of the class a test to take to demonstrate the same learning, that would be ideal. So that's one thing. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
also a big believer in sort of primary prevention. If we can upskill our kids really early on, start in pre-K kindergarten to upskill them, I think, I know social emotional learning is sort of the sexy thing right now.
Yeah.
I actually think if the next frontier is in executive functioning skills,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
metacognitive and executive functioning skills. If we start scaffolding and building that in kindergarten and training kids to understand how to self-control, how to regulate their own emotions, regulate their own attention, regulate their own focus in what it is they are good at, and learn those skills early on, I think we will actually have a much more successful generation of learners. We will
Mm-hmm.
need fewer tier two and tier three. I think we'll need fewer formal accommodations as we move forward if we do a good job of building that into early education alongside literacy and numeracy.
Yeah, absolutely. So like a universal design initiative for executive functioning, like it should be baked in.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Baked in every lesson, in every school, in every kindergarten and first grade.
That that's one of the biggest challenges that I have found with executive functioning because the people that I interact with that are focusing on it are tier three special ed, like, and what I am trying to shift people away from is, of course, yes, some kids do need those interventions, and that we will never completely eliminate kids needing special education, but the implementation of that will be so much easier and seamless if we have robust tier one or general education and we start thinking about it before we get to the point that we're thinking about tier three. And I think that it will offload. And I think the other thing for teachers, like you said, they're so overworked that if you can embed work on executive functioning, if that becomes the new social emotional learning, or we redefine what social emotional learning is, then it's in everyone's habits. It doesn't feel like this extra thing. And I think that that's the biggest challenge that a lot of the people who are like the related service providers, the OTs, the psychologists, the speech pathologists, the social workers who are like, people are sending these kids to me and expecting me to work magic with a 20-minute social skills group and call that social emotional learning when the initiative needs to happen school wide. So,
Absolutely. And you're pointing to, again, what I think is a big structural problem when
hmm
we have siloed totally different people to focus on executive functioning. We've got
hmm
our special ed teachers and our related service providers, not our general ed teachers.
hmm
We've got them so separated that we've not trained our gen ed teachers to do this. That extra special training that special ed instructors get, that certainly our SLPs and OTs and social workers and school psychologists
hmm
have baked into their training. Um, it sort of gets outsourced in that 20 minutes a week
Yeah.
or 3 times a week. And it it is expected to be alchemy and magic and
Yeah.
take this kid, fix them in your 20 minutes and send them back. And I expect them to be learning like every other kid. For neurodivergent kids, that may not be the case, right? They may need something different, something more. But for many kids who are just bad at self-regulating, who don't have those executive functioning skills, if we could get them earlier, if we could get our general education system on board with baking this into what is the normal of education early on for general education, we would, truly believe, see fewer kids need tier two and ultimately tier three services.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad we started with this conversation because I know we wanted to talk about assessment, but I think that when you're talking about doing a neuropsych eval, you would hope that by the time you get to that point, there's there has been robust general education instruction rather than starting with evaluation because you'd end up doing way more evaluations if you don't have those strong supports in place across the continuum. But I know that I do get a lot of questions from parents who are seeking services for their children who maybe feel like their children aren't getting their needs met in school, or from clinicians who are either in private practice or who are in the schools trying to figure out, okay, I have a child who has language or executive functioning or learning needs. And what assessments do I give them? And what should that assessment process look like? So I would love to talk just more generally about, okay, like let's assume that we've waved our magic wand and the system is, we've got these great supports in place, but we do have a student who is needs an evaluation. What could that evaluation look like if you are looking at something like executive functioning that's so abstract and really hard to define with numbers and standard scores?
Absolutely. I will answer that before we get there. You've brought up such an important point. One of the biggest things we talk about in educational assessment is OTL, opportunity to learn. So we
hmm
want to make sure that a kid that I'm seeing in my private practice or a kid that we evaluate at parallel within their school, we want to make sure that they have had the opportunity to learn what they should be learning at the level where they are. If they're a third grader, they should have had opportunity to learn the material kindergarten, first and second grade. And sometimes the systems are such that they have not had great opportunity to learn. So that's the first question is, have they had the opportunity? Have they had the sort of natural supports that we would expect from a decent enough or good school so that we are sure there's a problem that might be more brain-based, right? That this is not just an ecological problem of a terrible school or
hmm
an overburdened school or a set of teachers who are problematic in certain ways. So that's the first thing. We want to establish that they have at least had the opportunity to learn. Then we start thinking about what the evaluation looks like.
Are you working with students who experience anxiety and overwhelm with new challenges, who refuse or avoid difficult tasks, or require constant prompting? Or maybe they have difficulty filtering distractions, they're missing assignments, they tend to run late, and they struggle to transfer skills from one setting to another, or don't appear to learn from past mistakes. These behaviors are showing up more and more frequently in classrooms across schools and not just in special education. The truth is, we're seeing a surge of students in both general and special education who desperately need these foundational skills. With so many competing priorities and options for educators, it seems impossible for school leaders to know where to focus their attention. What if there was a way to transform multiple challenges with one powerful approach without overwhelming your already maxed out team? Turns out there is. Beneath many of these challenges often lies a powerful root cause: executive functioning. Executive functioning skills are the critical mental processes that work behind the scenes as your internal coach, acting like your brain's CEO. These powerful cognitive abilities help you manage frustrations, make decisions, follow through on plans, envision the future, and adapt when things don't go as expected. And let's be honest, teachers are drowning between curriculum requirements, testing pressures, behavior management, and the mountain of paperwork. They're stretched thinner than ever. The last thing they need is another standalone program to implement. That's why I've created the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course to launching your team's executive functioning implementation plan. When you join, each day you'll get an email with a summary walking you through a foundational concept that will help you design an implementation plan for your team. We'll uncover executive functioning challenges, and I'll show you how to identify the telltale signs. We'll organize skills for intervention, and we'll wrap up with essential takeaways and a prompt to help you get started with your 90-day action plan, plus a curated list of resources to provide support and help you implement what you've learned. To learn more about the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders.
And when we're talking about executive functioning, when we're talking about a potential ADHD or a processing disorder or something like that, we have tools in our toolkit as psychologists that can help us understand how a kid is functioning. They fall into two major categories. One set of tests is looking at typical functioning. How does this kid interact with the world in their everyday? And that's important to know. Those tend to be surveys for the kid themselves, teachers, parents. We do these standardized surveys to figure out what is their everyday functioning. Then, if we're doing more of a neuropsych-oriented evaluation, we then also give what are called optimal or maximal functioning measures. This is what can their brain do in a perfect environment or a nearly perfect environment. So that is a distraction-free room, one-on-one attention with me, hopefully being a nice person, smiling, being friendly, having a decent quality of relationship, and motivation to succeed. So I will be championing this kid and saying, do your best. And it's okay if you don't answer every question perfectly. This is trying to look at what their brain, you can't see me, but I'm pointing to my prefrontal cortex, right? I am trying to figure out what could your brain do under the best possible circumstances. And this is important to note because there may be a stark difference between what your brain can do and what it does do in your everyday life. When there are distractions, when you have friends around you, when you have a teacher you don't like or a teacher you really do like, or stuff going on at home, when there's all of this other messiness in our lives, which we have plenty of messiness in every life, our brain doesn't always function the way it could under ideal circumstances. So we want to know both of these things. If we're doing an evaluation in the school, our goal is a little bit different than if we're doing it in a private practice or in a private group. In school, our goal is to identify a disability that's getting in the way of your learning. So if you could have ADHD, but it's not getting in the way of your learning, that would have been me growing up, right? So I certainly have an ADHD brain. That's the way my brain works, but it wasn't getting in the way of my learning because my grades were okay. I was doing fine on projects, and so it wasn't getting in the way. If you're coming to me in my private practice, we have a different goal, which is to figure out if you meet criteria for a diagnosis and what's really going on, and how can I make some recommendations for you to thrive, which is a little different, right?
Yeah.
What's getting in the way of your learning has to be what a school cares about. Because if nothing's getting in the way of your learning, then we're good to go.
Yeah.
I care more about what's going to help you thrive. So even if you're learning okay, this may not be what your life looks like thriving. So I may care about, oh, well, your everyday functioning is okay. You may be a little impulsive or a little hyperactive or a little inattentive. Your learning is fine. Your learning's going okay. But when I'm looking at your optimal functioning under optimal circumstances, I'm also seeing some problems. So I might think about, oh, well, this kid, even under optimal conditions, even if I gave you all the accommodations in the world to make school look just like my friendly office, you're still going to struggle. This may be a case where you need some real intervention of some sort. We may need to do some organizational skills training. OST is an evidence-based program for improving executive functions. You may need to consult with a psychiatrist to see if maybe medication could be helpful. If you are really struggling in your everyday functioning, the typical functioning is messy and inattentive, but your optimal functioning is perfectly fine. These are the kids that just need a lot of good accommodations. They're the ones who maybe do need a room alone for test taking or better scaffolding on projects where we break it down into its component parts for a kid, but they can actually do the work and they can accomplish all of those individual goals. It's just the big project that is overwhelming to them.
Yeah.
So the goals of these two different types of evaluations are different. The tools, therefore, are a little bit different. But those are the typical things that we are using in our evaluations. These typical functioning measures, the surveys for teachers, parents, self-report if a kid is old enough to self-report. Observation is a typical functioning measure. If I
Hmm.
go and sit in the back of a class and watch a kid, that is how they're functioning typically. And then our optimal functioning measures, and these are our IQ tests, as
Hmm.
well as our what are known as CPTs, continuous performance tests, which are really boring, typically computer-based tests that really tax an ADHD brain
Yeah.
because they are so boring. I like
I've
I'm
taken some of those myself, and it's a lot.
I even hate administering them.
Yeah.
They're 14 minutes long or 17 minutes long, depending on what you're doing, and it's the longest less than 20 minutes of my life, and I'm not even taking it. I'm just sitting watching a
Are
kid do it.
those the ones where sometimes you have to listen to different sounds and like, is this different than the pattern of sounds that you heard? Or is that something different?
That's something different. Those are also those auditory processing tests.
Yeah.
Those are optimal functioning tests. We've got other executive functioning tests that are very often used that are looking at things like cognitive set switching. So if I give you a strategy and it no longer works, can you switch your strategy, or do you
Hmm.
get locked into that strategy? And ADHD brains, autistic brains, some learning disabled brains, they have real difficulty switching those cognitive sets to try a new strategy. So there are
Yeah.
all sorts of these optimal functioning measures that we use in our neuropsych evaluations.
Do you have, because I know people are going to ask in the category of surveys or optimal functioning, do you have tests that you recommend or that are your, I don't want to say go-to tests, but are ones that you commonly use just because they have good validity and reliability and psychometric properties?
Certainly. And I always hesitate to just like
I
recommend
know.
tests because I don't want to like sound like I'm for one test publisher or charge
Right.
more
I
money or something like
know.
that. But
Yeah.
there are, for typical performance tests, again, we break it down a little bit more. There are broadband measures that are very widely used, like the BASC,
Hmm.
Behavior Assessment System for Children, which
Yep.
is very, very widely used. And it's got self-report, teacher report, parent
Hmm.
report. And that gives us a broad view of what's going on. It's got scales for emotional functioning and behavioral
Hmm.
functioning and attention and hyperactivity and all these sorts of things. Um, and based on what I see in those, then I use narrow band measures. And those narrower band measures, when I see some evidence of executive dysfunction or problems with attention or any of these things, I might use a brief, which is
Hmm.
the behavior rating
Yep.
index for executive functioning. That's probably not right. Inventory for executive functioning,
Yeah.
or a
Yeah.
CEFI, which is the comprehensive executive function inventory, or the DRET. Like there are narrow band measures that are, some are better psychometrically than others, but all of them ask pretty much the same stuff. So
Hmm.
that's for surveys. Those are my go-tos. IQ tests. we have a handful of IQ tests and even CPTs. There are a handful of CPTs, the test of variables of attention, the TOVA, or the Connors CPT-3 are very widely used. Other people, there's a newer one called the MOXO that people are liking and using. I've used it as well. Um, each of them has strengths and weaknesses. When it comes to skills, when it comes to evaluating skills or functioning, which is what we care about, what I care about as
Yeah.
a psychologist, I'm really caring about skills and functioning. Skills are things like academic skills or verbal ability or IQ and these sorts of things, or executive function skills. Functioning is your everyday functioning, your social functioning, your academic functioning. These are the things I care about. Um, but our tooling is not like medical tests. I can't put you on a scale and tell you what your verbal ability is, or I can't take your blood and tell you what your executive functioning skills are. So every test we have at our disposal is necessarily a proxy for
Yeah.
underlying skills, and that means they come with error. So
Hmm.
all of them have error, and it's why it's so complicated. It's why our evaluations need to triangulate so much. It's why we need to collaborate with SLPs, OTs, social workers. We need to collaborate with teachers in our evaluations to get the same sort of target, the same thing we're trying to understand from multiple angles to
Yeah.
try to correct for that error. Otherwise, if my tests were perfect, I wouldn't need anyone else. I would give you the perfect evaluation and tell you exactly what is going on for a kid in every arena of their life and how their brain is functioning, and tell you exactly what we should be doing with them educationally. It's unfortunately way more complicated than that because we don't have that crystal ball into exactly what's going on with a kid and their functioning.
It's so funny because as I'm listening to you talk about assessments, you do it exactly the way that I do, where people are always like, "What test do I give?" And then you start with the broader categories because if you start with the test, you're being too myopic. Because again, obviously people do need to know what are examples of tests, but there's always that context of what are the big buckets that I'm thinking about before I even think about what is my actual standardized tool, if that's appropriate for this context. How often do
Yeah,
you use things like work samples and non-standardized ratings or observations if you feel like you need more robust descriptive information in addition to the standardized measures that you're using?
yeah, I start my evaluations with a clinical interview, no matter what. And that is, an unstandardized, I follow a sequence and it's a
Hmm.
structured interview, but it is completely unstandardized. There's no scores that emerge
Right.
from a clinical interview. And that clues me in to create some hypotheses of what likely could be happening. And you're absolutely right. If I started with a very specific measure, if somebody came in and was like, this kid is having difficulties focusing, and I
Hmm.
just gave a test of attention, then I would diagnose everybody with ADHD.
Yeah.
But the actual diagnosis of ADHD says that it cannot be better accounted for by something else going on. And we know that kids don't, and grown-ups do not pay good attention if they're depressed or if they're anxious or if they're preoccupied with their parents getting divorced or whatever it is. All these
Hmm.
things come to fruition in poor attention. So our broadband measures, our clinical interview is meant to help us rule out all these other things that could be going on. I think that there are too many evaluations happening that are so focused on attention and executive functioning that they're missing trauma,
Hmm.
right? Trauma can manifest as poor attention. And if we ignore the trauma and call it ADHD, we're not going to be giving the kid what they need or the grown-up what they need. We're not
Hmm.
going to be accommodating the right thing. We may be giving them some Adderall, we may be giving them, some medication, which frankly helps everybody, right?
Hmm.
Anybody will focus better if they're given Adderall or Ritalin or, some other medication. Um, but whether that constitutes true ADHD, whether an accommodation of sitting alone in a room would help them, probably not. if it's truly trauma or depression or something else going on. So we need to be very careful. And the way we do that is by being very, very broad-based to begin with and making sure we're attending to the right things throughout the evaluation process. Now, work samples and observations, I don't tend to use them very heavily. The research on like classroom observations is not compelling to me. I
Okay.
know it's required in a lot of school-based
Yeah.
evaluations, and so I'll do it if I'm doing a school-based evaluation that requires me to go sit in a room and watch a kid play or at recess time or learn as part of a lesson. I'll do it and I'll write down my observations. But there's something called the Hawthorne effect, which means that when a kid is being
Mm-hmm.
evaluated, they behave differently. So if they know you're sitting back there or even if they know a stranger is in the room doing something weird, they may not behave the way they typically would, nor
Mm-hmm.
will every other kid in that room, and that can affect how this kid is behaving. Um, so that's a problem with classroom observations. It's also just one little snippet. I trust teachers on rating scales, on the standardized rating scales, to let me know what is most typical of that kid, rather than an anomaly of a day where they didn't sleep the night before, or were
Mm-hmm.
really hungry, or something weird was going on that day, or maybe they're on their best behavior because a stranger is sitting in the back of the room watching. So I tend to believe teachers on these standardized rating scales. If I'm not getting enough, I might do a more informal interview with teachers, which I find much more informative than a classroom observation.
Mm-hmm.
Work samples I get in my evaluations. If I'm doing an academic test like the Wyatt or the Woodcock-Johnson test of academic achievement, I will get writing samples. I will get reading samples. I will get some comprehension. So I'll use those standardized measures, but I'm also paying attention. I'm also looking at their hand grip of their pencil. I'm also looking for, is their leg shaking all the way through this one task and it wasn't in every other task? Okay, that may be telling me something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I I like the idea of starting broader and just figuring out, okay, where do I go from here? And I think that it's so hard when people ask, well, what assessment should I give this student? And it's like, well, I don't know. I don't know the student. Like, what kind of information do you have in order to guide you? So, yeah, I appreciate that
It's the last thing
discussion.
providers want to hear is that it's a choose your own adventure.
Yeah,
And based on this one, you have to select something else. They want like a set battery from the beginning. And sometimes we can do that. If we're
yeah,
evaluating for dyslexia, I could give you a battery that will
right.
help you in or out dyslexia. That's straightforward. But when we're not sure, when it's more behavioral or social emotional or executive functioning or more amorphous, when it's not like reading or math, this kid is struggling at math, I can tell you a great battery from math
Yeah.
evaluation. But when it's more behavioral and there are so many things that affect our behaviors, it's tougher to create sort of a standardized battery.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to transition to this conversation about access and some of the work that you're doing at Parallel Learning and just how this relates to doing offering good services and just the conversation about teletherapy assessment. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about what services you offer and how you're taking all of these things that we've talked about so far and applying them to the services and just what you offer.
Yeah. So at Parallel, we offer multiple services. So we are trying to partner with schools. We're trying to be a partner with schools, all remote. Everything we do is virtual and remote over our platform. And we are trying to up resource schools. So schools that are overburdened in either their evaluations or the services they're providing can partner with us and we are doing evidence-based services. For better or worse, they ended up with me as their chief clinical officer. And at heart, I'm just a nerdy academic and care about the quality and won't allow cutting corners or anything like that. I've done the research. I have been spearheading the research in teleassessment and telework for a decade now. I'm very old. So I work with our providers, our school psychologists, our SLPs, our special ed instructors, social workers, whoever we're working with. I work with them to make sure that they're doing it in an evidence-based way. So we partner with test companies to build the tests into the platform so that they are there and ready. But they're doing it in alignment with the research. And certainly there are other companies that are offering similar services. I don't know if they are
Hmm.
doing it in alignment with the research. I
Yeah.
hope they are. I hope they are
Yeah.
doing it, not cutting corners.
I've seen a wide range. I've talked to people from a lot of companies. There's quite a range. So,
Yeah, so we are we are pretty exacting in our standards because
hmm.
my name is on it, and I care
Yeah.
about my reputation and keeping everything above board. But we are providing, yes, evaluations. We're doing SLP evaluations, school psych evaluations, psychoed evaluations, psychosocial evaluations. We're doing that. We're partnering with schools, so we've found ways to do classroom evaluations when we need to. It's fairly easy to have a para in the back of the room holding a little iPad that we have now visibility into the entire classroom. That's not rocket science. But we are also really trying to superpower services through technology. So we are doing SLP services. So we're doing speech and language therapy. We're doing behavioral mental health services. We're even doing specialized instruction. We've got special ed teachers who are providing specialized instruction in our platform. But we are also really trying to say, how can we make this not just as good as in-person services, but even better?
Hmm.
So how can I make our ecosystem really engaging for a student or a small group of students? How can we make it really engaging? How can we upskill our provider so that they have ready-made tools at their disposal, evidence-based curricula at their disposal so that they are doing exactly what that kid needs? I call it precision intervention or precision instruction, which is a little bit more than individualized. Individualized is doing the right thing in the moment for that, or the right thing for this kid. Precision, when we talk about like precision medicine,
Hmm.
is doing the right intervention for the right kid at the right moment in time.
Hmm.
So we can use technology to say, oh, we're tracking how this kid is doing in their IEP goal. We're tracking how they did last session. Here's a little pop-up that says, here's how they did last session. I recommend that you work a little bit more on this skill in this session, if it's speech
Hmm.
therapy. And here are some games you can play or tools you can use. So we're building that in a way that I don't have to go to my, I do therapy. I don't have to go to my closet and pull out a board game and be
Yes.
like, today is really a Connect Four day.
Yeah.
I've got that all built in for me, and my platform can say, try doing, Battleship today because this kid needs a little bit of frustration tolerance or whatever it is. They need to
Hmm.
work on this skill that is aligned with their IEP goals. So we're trying to supercharge the work that we're doing through our technology platform. We're always improving it as we go.
That's really interesting, and it reminds me of some work I'm doing for my other job. So, with just, I think what you're doing is it's eliminating decision fatigue for the clinician so that they can it frees up resources to be engaged. Because I think that was my biggest challenge as a clinician and a lot of the therapists that come to me were when they ask you things about what's my assessment protocol, what they're really asking for is certainty and to eliminate decisions because to eliminate some of their overwhelm because it's constant like adjustment and when you're working with the client and if we can streamline some of those things and free up some bandwidth, I think it ends up helping the clinicians provide higher quality services.
Absolutely. They can focus on the relationship and on the work. And those are the two big things that need to happen. You need to be able to build a relationship with a kid where they feel trusted and heard and seen, and they're able to learn from you those skills that they need to learn. And the work needs to support those IEP goals. So I don't necessarily think of it as like deciding for you. I think of it kind of as a co-pilot. So
Yeah.
it's there to give you some options, some suggestions, and you're right. we have infinite decisions
Mm-hmm.
that we can make in any given moment. And if we can narrow that down to what the research says will be most helpful in this moment, what the evidence base says is most likely to connect with this kid in this moment, then the provider can be like, oh, I'm going to focus on this kid now instead of
Mm-hmm.
the back of my mind thinking, oh, what am I going to do next? Or
Yeah.
when this activity ends, what can I do to fill the time? Or like I need to work on the letter R with this kid. What story has a lot of R's in it? Or
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Like if we can provide that to you in the moment, on the other side of it, we are also really trying to reduce the fatigue of paperwork and all
Yeah.
those other things where you actually don't need the brain of a psychologist or a social worker or an SLP, like those tedious things to like check mark. Yes, I did this. It took this amount of time. All of those compliance goals, like those can be automated.
Right.
We can
Yeah.
take the burden off so that you can focus on doing the good work with kids.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what's on the horizon for Parallel and the next year? What exciting events and things do you have coming up?
Oh, there's just so much exciting. We are
Yeah.
continually improving our platform, getting feedback from our providers of what would be most useful, what could be more engaging, and really trying to build that co-pilot in that evidence-based way, leveraging AI, leveraging machine learning to think about what is going to be most useful for this kid in this moment. And how do we communicate that in the most seamless way possible to a provider so that they can use that information in real time in the moment. That is what we're sort of continually building and working toward.
Great. I'm excited to see what you're working on, and I know that we've got some ongoing collaborations planned, so I will definitely be excited to see what you come up with this year and where things go. So, where can people go to learn more about you and your work, and as well as parallel learning and the some of the services and opportunities that you might offer for clinicians and providers?
Yeah, parallellearning.com has everything on there. A pretty user-friendly website. It's got a little information on me. We also I write white papers as well, which is just a summary of the research in a user-friendly way. So I have a white paper on executive functioning and executive function coaching. I have one on teleassessment. These are free on parallellearning.com.
Okay,
So I
great.
encourage anybody who's interested. There are many more than that as well. Tele-SLP. I collaborated with one of our great SLP providers to write a paper on where the evidence is in tele-SLP services. So I encourage people to go and download some of the white papers completely free.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll link to all those things. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with our amazing guest. And also be sure to check the show notes for more information about the School Leaders Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course that shows school leaders how to get started with their executive functioning implementation plan. To learn more about the program, you can go to Dudek-Brannan.com/school leaders. I created the School Leaders Guide to Executive Functioning Support because educators have to be everything to everyone in current times. There always seems to be a new initiative, and it can be really difficult for teams to implement yet another standalone program. But the great news about executive functioning support is that it doesn't require complicated materials. It can be seamlessly layered onto existing practices and amplify the effort that you put into content area curriculum. And most importantly, executive functioning support can help you to differentiate instruction for those students who need support in special education as well as general education. It can be a really powerful universal design initiative that ensures you're meeting students where they're at. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudekbrannan.com /school leaders. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with anyone you think would benefit from the information. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.